For weeks, one of the most important waterways on the entire planet sat almost completely frozen, choked off and functionally closed, with more than 1,500 commercial vessels and roughly 23,000 mariners trapped inside the Persian Gulf, unable to move in or out. Ships that should have been delivering oil, fuel, and fertilizer to ports across the globe instead sat anchored for weeks, their crews stuck in limbo while insurance premiums climbed and global energy markets grew increasingly nervous about how much longer this standoff could actually hold before something had to give. And then, in the span of a single order from the top of the chain of command, the United States military launched an operation large enough to physically force that waterway back open, deploying 15,000 troops, more than 100 aircraft, guided missile destroyers, and a web of unmanned systems into one of the most contested stretches of water in the world. It's called Project Freedom, and what it represents is nothing short of the largest, most direct challenge to Iran's grip on the Strait of Hormuz that this entire conflict has seen so far. Let's break down exactly what this operation is, how it actually works, what it's already accomplished, and why it might be the single most consequential military decision of this entire standoff, one that could either finally break the deadlock or drag this entire region back into a fight nobody has officially agreed to stop having. To understand why this operation matters so much, you have to understand exactly what had been happening in the Strait in the weeks leading up to it. Since the earlier phase of this conflict kicked off at the end of February, Iran had effectively sealed off the Strait of Hormuz through a combination of threats, mines, missile strikes, and roaming fast attack boats, creating a de facto blockade that held even after a ceasefire was formally announced in early April. That ceasefire, on paper, was supposed to end major combat operations. In practice, kinetic exchanges kept happening in and around the waterway anyway. Commercial shipping companies, unwilling to risk multi-million-dollar vessels and the lives of their crews, simply stopped sending ships through. The result was a maritime traffic jam unlike anything the region had seen in decades. Over 1,500 vessels representing more than 80 different countries sitting anchored and idle, waiting for someone to make the corridor safe again. That's not an abstract inconvenience. The Strait of Hormuz carries somewhere close to a fifth of the entire world's oil supply, along with massive volumes of fuel and fertilizer critical to global agriculture. Every single day that corridor stayed closed sent shockwaves through energy markets and supply chains, stretching from Rotterdam to Tokyo. So the decision came down from the president directly, approved through a broader diplomatic and economic framework known as the Maritime Freedom Construct, a plan reportedly greenlit by the Secretary of State in late April, specifically designed to pair military escort operations with coordinated diplomatic outreach to shipping companies and partner nations. The military execution of that plan is Project Freedom, and Central Command wasted no time getting it moving. The operation was formally announced on a Sunday and was already active by Monday morning, an extraordinarily fast turnaround for a mission of this scale, which tells you just how urgently Washington wanted this corridor forced back open, rather than allowing the standoff to drag on indefinitely. Let's talk about the actual scale of what got deployed, because this isn't some symbolic patrol meant to make a point. And understanding the sheer breadth of assets involved helps explain why this operation was framed as such a dramatic escalation in the first place. Roughly 15,000 American service members are involved in supporting this mission in one capacity or another, spread across ships, aircraft, and shore-based coordination centers throughout the region. More than 100 land and sea-based aircraft are flying continuous coverage over the strait, providing what officials describe as round-the-clock surveillance capable of detecting, tracking, and neutralizing threats across both the air and sea domains simultaneously. Guided missile destroyers form the backbone of the actual escort operation, sailing directly alongside commercial vessels as they make the transit, while a layered network of unmanned platforms extends the reach of that surveillance picture even further, watching for mines, small boats, and anything else that might threaten a convoy before it ever gets close enough to matter. Command and coordination for the entire operation runs out of Central Command headquarters in Florida, working in constant real-time contact with vessels actually making the transit thousands of miles away, while the State Department handles the diplomatic side of the equation, serving as the connective tissue between partner nations and the shipping industry itself. The Defense Secretary described the operation in a Pentagon briefing using 3 specific words that are worth sitting with for a second, because they tell you a lot about how this mission is officially being framed. Defensive in nature. Focused in scope. Temporary in duration. That framing matters because it's an attempt to thread an extremely difficult needle. Washington wants to physically break Iran's blockade and force the strait back open through overwhelming military presence, but it doesn't want to be seen as reigniting full-scale war, especially with a ceasefire technically still in effect. And Iran responded almost immediately, in exactly the way you'd expect from a regime that had built weeks of leverage around controlling this exact corridor. Even as the first commercial vessels began attempting the transit under American escort, Iranian forces targeted a tanker belonging to a Gulf neighbor right as the operation got underway. A clear signal that Tehran had no intention of simply standing aside and watching its blockade get dismantled without a fight. Iranian officials publicly dismissed American claims of successful transits as baseless, insisting the operation wasn't achieving what Washington said it was achieving. That denial became a recurring theme throughout the opening days of the mission, mirroring almost exactly the same pattern of claim and counterclaim that's defined nearly every major engagement throughout this entire conflict. The United States announces a concrete result. Iran denies it happened, or reframes it as something else entirely. And then, usually within a day or two, independent confirmation from shipping companies, satellite tracking, or open-source vessel monitoring settles the question definitively. In this case, that confirmation came fast. A major international shipping company confirmed that one of its American-flagged vessels had successfully completed the transit under direct U.S. military protection. And Central Command reported that a second U.S.-flagged merchant ship had also made it through safely. 2 Navy destroyers reportedly escorted those vessels directly through the most contested stretch of the waterway. That might not sound like an overwhelming number on its own, just a couple of ships making it through on the operation's opening days. But the significance isn't really about the raw count. It's about proving the concept works at all. For weeks, the assumption baked into global shipping decisions was that the strait simply couldn't be safely transited under current conditions. The moment even a small number of vessels made it through successfully under direct military escort, that assumption broke, and once an assumption like that breaks, the psychological and economic pressure on Iran to maintain its blockade starts eroding fast. Because the entire value of a blockade depends on everyone believing it's actually unbreakable. Let's get into how this escort system actually functions mechanically, because it's a genuinely sophisticated piece of coordinated military logistics. U.S. forces established what officials describe as a heavily defended maritime security zone running along the southern portion of the strait, effectively creating a protected corridor that commercial vessels can move through under constant watch, rather than attempting the crossing alone and exposed. Within that corridor, guided missile destroyers physically escort convoys of merchant ships, positioned to intercept threats before they can close distance on the vessels they're protecting. Overhead, that layered air network of more than 100 aircraft, a mix of fighters, surveillance platforms, and unmanned systems, maintains continuous coverage, watching for exactly the kind of fast boat swarms, drone launches, and missile threats that have defined Iran's approach to contesting this waterway throughout the entire conflict. It's essentially the maritime equivalent of an armed convoy system, the same basic concept navies have used for over a century to move vulnerable cargo through contested waters, except updated with modern radar, satellite tracking, and unmanned surveillance that gives commanders a real-time picture of the entire security zone, rather than relying purely on what individual ship captains can see with their own eyes. Let's get into the specific hardware carrying this operation, because the choice of platforms tells you a lot about how seriously this mission was planned. The destroyers escorting these convoys are Arleigh Burke-class ships, the backbone of the modern American surface fleet, built around an integrated combat system that fuses radar tracking, missile defense, and surface gunnery into a single real-time picture the crew can act on instantly. These are the same ships that have handled nearly every major naval engagement throughout this entire conflict, and putting them directly in the escort role for Project Freedom signals that commanders wanted proven, combat-tested platforms leading this mission rather than experimental or less capable vessels. Above the water, the mix of more than 100 aircraft spans manned fighters running combat air patrol, dedicated surveillance platforms watching for missile launches and small boat movements, and multi-domain unmanned systems capable of loitering over the strait for extended periods without needing to return to base, extending the overall surveillance picture well beyond what manned aircraft alone could sustain around the clock. That layered combination, proven destroyers on the water, and a dense, persistent air picture above it, is specifically designed to close the exact gaps Iran has tried to exploit throughout this conflict. The brief windows where a fast boat or a missile battery might otherwise slip through unnoticed before closing distance on a vulnerable target. It's worth putting this entire standoff in historical context too, because the Strait of Hormuz has been a flashpoint for American naval operations before, and the parallels are worth understanding. Decades ago, during a previous period of regional conflict, the United States Navy ran an extended campaign specifically to protect commercial shipping through these same waters after Iranian forces began targeting tankers with mines and missile attacks. That earlier campaign, though fought with far less advanced technology than what's deployed today, established the basic template. Project Freedom is now running on a larger and more sophisticated scale, escorted convoys, active mine clearance, and a persistent naval presence specifically designed to make the economic cost of interfering with shipping too high for Iran to sustain indefinitely. History doesn't repeat exactly, but the underlying logic hasn't changed much. Iran's leverage over this waterway has always depended on making the cost of transiting it too high for shipping companies to accept. American counterstrategy has always depended on making the cost of interfering with that shipping too high for Iran to accept instead. Project Freedom is simply the newest, most technologically advanced version of that same decades-old contest playing out in the same strategically vital stretch of water. Now, let's talk about the cost of running an operation like this, because it hasn't come without real losses on both sides. The Secretary of State disclosed that 10 civilian sailors have died as a direct result of the ongoing conflict surrounding the strait. A sobering reminder that even a defensively framed escort operation is unfolding in genuinely dangerous, contested waters where mistakes or successful attacks carry lethal consequences. On the other side of the ledger, the U.S. Navy has destroyed 7 Iranian fast boats in the waterway during this operation, continuing the same pattern of decisive, lopsided naval engagements that have characterized nearly every direct confrontation between American and Iranian forces throughout this conflict. And in a detail that speaks directly to how contested this information environment remains, U.S. officials had to separately and explicitly deny Iranian claims that an American military vessel had been struck during the operation. A claim that, like so many before it, didn't hold up under scrutiny once independent tracking and official statements caught up with the initial announcement. There was also a genuinely alarming incident involving a French commercial vessel, which reportedly took a hit during the opening phase of the operation, underscoring just how real the danger remains even for ships operating under the protection of one of the most powerful naval escort systems in the world. That single incident is a useful reminder that Project Freedom, whatever its ultimate success, isn't some kind of magic shield that guarantees every single vessel makes it through completely unscathed. It's a dramatic reduction in risk, backed by overwhelming force and constant surveillance, but it's still unfolding inside an active conflict zone, where Iran retains the ability to occasionally land a hit even against a heavily defended target, particularly when that target is a commercial vessel rather than a heavily armored warship built specifically to absorb this kind of punishment. Shipping executives watching that single incident play out had to weigh it against everything else the operation had already demonstrated, a genuine tension between the reassurance of 2 successful transits and the reminder that even the strongest escort system doesn't eliminate risk entirely, only manages it down to something closer to survivable. Here's where the operation gets genuinely complicated, because barely a day after it launched, reports emerged that the mission had been temporarily halted. That pause matters enormously for understanding what this operation actually represents strategically. Forcing open a blockade this aggressively, this fast, always carried the risk of triggering exactly the kind of major escalation that both sides claimed they wanted to avoid. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff acknowledged publicly that Iranian attacks against American forces during this period fell below the threshold that would restart major combat operations, a careful, deliberately calibrated way of saying that things got tense, genuinely tense, without quite crossing the line into a full resumption of open warfare. When reporters pushed the president directly on what exactly would constitute a ceasefire violation serious enough to trigger a larger American response, his answer was about as blunt and unadorned as it gets. Iran already knows what not to do. That's not a detailed rules of engagement briefing. That's a deliberately vague warning designed to keep Tehran guessing about exactly where the real red line sits rather than handing over a precise checklist Iranian commanders could calibrate their next provocation around. And vagueness like that is often a deliberate strategic choice rather than an oversight. Military and diplomatic analysts watching this unfold flagged almost immediately that an operation structured this way, this aggressive, this fast-moving, dramatically increases the risk of miscalculation on both sides. That's not a minor concern. A convoy escort operation moving through one of the most militarized, contested waterways on the planet involves dozens of moving pieces, warships, aircraft, unmanned systems, commercial vessels, and Iranian forces all operating in close proximity simultaneously. In an environment that dense and that tense, a single miscommunication, a single false radar contact, a single Iranian fast boat closing distance a little too aggressively carries the potential to spiral into exactly the kind of large-scale confrontation neither side has officially declared it wants. That risk is precisely why the operation's own designers built in the language of being defensive, focused, and temporary from the very beginning, an attempt to give both sides an off-ramp if things start moving toward outright war rather than controlled pressure. And that leads directly into the political reaction back in Washington, because this operation didn't launch in a vacuum. It came with vocal support from lawmakers who had grown increasingly frustrated watching Iran stall diplomatically while continuing to strangle one of the world's most important shipping corridors. One senator put the frustration in particularly sharp terms, arguing publicly that Iran had been playing games through negotiations, that its most recent offer to end the conflict diplomatically had been genuinely absurd, and that the moment had come to forcefully regain freedom of navigation rather than continuing to wait on a diplomatic process that wasn't producing results. That kind of public pressure from Capitol Hill matters because it reflects a broader shift in patience across Washington. Diplomatic tracks involving Oman and other regional partners had been running in parallel throughout this entire conflict, and the growing frustration wasn't necessarily about abandoning diplomacy altogether. It was about signaling that diplomacy alone, without credible military pressure backing it up, wasn't going to be enough to actually force Iran's hand. Let's talk about the economic stakes sitting underneath all of this, because they're genuinely staggering once you actually break down the numbers. A corridor carrying roughly a fifth of global oil supply being effectively closed for weeks doesn't just inconvenience a handful of shipping companies, it ripples through every layer of the global economy simultaneously. Energy prices climb. Insurance premiums for any vessel willing to even attempt the transit spike dramatically. Countries dependent on imported fuel and fertilizer start facing real supply constraints that show up in everything from transportation costs to food prices months down the line. More than 1,500 vessels sitting idle represents an enormous amount of frozen capital, ships that cost enormous sums to operate every single day, whether they're moving cargo or sitting at anchor waiting for a green light that never comes. Every day that blockade held, the pressure on global markets compounded, which is exactly why the decision to launch an operation this large, this fast, carried such urgency at the political level, even with the very real risk of reigniting broader conflict hanging over every single transit. Regional allies were watching every single move of this operation with obvious interest, because the stakes here extend well beyond American and Iranian interests alone. Gulf states positioned close to the strait have their own economies deeply intertwined with the safe flow of shipping through that corridor, and a genuinely restored, secure transit route benefits every single one of them, regardless of how they've positioned themselves diplomatically throughout this broader conflict. At the same time, those same nations understand better than almost anyone else exactly how quickly Iranian retaliation can spread sideways onto targets that had nothing directly to do with the operation triggering it, given how many of them have already absorbed missile and drone strikes at various points throughout this conflict, simply for hosting American forces or supporting the broader pressure campaign against Tehran. That dynamic puts regional partners in a genuinely difficult position, quietly hoping Project Freedom succeeds in restoring safe passage, while simultaneously bracing for the possibility that Iran decides to spread its response across the region, rather than confining retaliation strictly to American assets directly involved in the escort mission. There's also a broader signal this operation sends about how Washington intends to handle challenges to freedom of navigation going forward, not just in this specific conflict, but as a template for how the United States responds anywhere a hostile actor attempts to unilaterally close off a critical international waterway. Every major shipping nation, every insurance underwriter, and every foreign government watching this play out is drawing conclusions about what it actually takes to force a blockade open once diplomacy alone fails to resolve it. A successful, sustained version of Project Freedom becomes a powerful demonstration that economic coercion through control of a choke point has a real, credible military counter available whenever the political will exists to deploy it. A failed or aborted version, one that collapses back into open warfare or simply can't scale to meaningful throughput, sends the opposite signal, that determined regional actors can still hold global commerce hostage as long as they're willing to accept the risk of a limited, contained military response in return. It's worth pausing here to think about what success actually looks like for an operation like this, because getting 2 or 3 vessels through safely on the opening days is meaningfully different from restoring the kind of sustained, high-volume commercial traffic. The global economy actually needs flowing through that corridor. The real operational question hanging over Project Freedom from the very beginning was whether it could scale, whether a system built around a handful of carefully escorted transits per day could eventually expand into something capable of clearing the massive backlog of stranded vessels within a reasonable time frame. That's an enormous logistical challenge, even setting aside the security risk entirely. Coordinating destroyer escorts, aircraft coverage, and unmanned surveillance for a handful of ships is one thing. Scaling that same protective umbrella to cover dozens of simultaneous transits a day, the kind of throughput actually required to meaningfully unclog 1,500 stranded vessels requires a completely different level of sustained military commitment, and it's far from obvious that even 15,000 troops and 100 aircraft represent enough capacity to get there without additional reinforcement. And that scaling question is tightly coupled to a second question that matters just as much: whether the ceasefire itself survives the stress of running this operation at all. Every additional transit represents another opportunity for miscalculation, another moment where an Iranian fast boat, a stray missile, or an aggressive intercept could tip the entire fragile arrangement back into open warfare. Analysts covering this operation describe those two questions. The operational one about scaling throughput and the political one about ceasefire survival as fundamentally coupled to each other, with neither having an obvious answer on its own. You can't really evaluate whether Project Freedom succeeds purely by counting how many ships make it through safely, because the moment that count starts triggering a serious Iranian response, significant enough to collapse the ceasefire entirely, the operation's success by one measure becomes a catastrophic failure by another. It's a genuinely difficult balance to strike, protect enough shipping to matter economically, without provoking enough of a reaction to undo the very ceasefire that's kept this conflict from spiraling back into full-scale war in the first place, and there's no guarantee that balance can actually be held indefinitely, no matter how carefully commanders try to manage it day by day. Media coverage of this operation split along predictably different lines depending on where you looked, and that divide itself tells you something about how contested the strategic wisdom of this move actually is. Coverage from the political left tended to frame the operation with real skepticism, describing it as a high-stakes, high-risk gamble that puts an already fragile ceasefire under enormous strain, with some reporting citing anonymous sources expressing genuine concern about the psychology driving decisions at the highest levels of government during this period. Coverage from the political right tended to frame the same operation far more triumphantly, emphasizing the achievement of forcing the strait back open through decisive action, rather than dwelling on the risks involved, with some headlines going so far as to describe the strait as already opened even while the operation was still in its earliest, most uncertain days. That gap between how quickly different outlets were willing to declare victory versus how cautiously others treated the same set of facts is itself a useful lesson in how much narrative framing shapes public perception of a story that, in reality, was still very much unresolved. Both framings are, in their own way, capturing something real. This operation genuinely does represent a dramatic, high-risk assertion of military force specifically designed to break an economic stranglehold that diplomacy alone hadn't managed to resolve. Whether that gamble ultimately pays off in sustained, safe commercial traffic through the strait, or whether it becomes the spark that reignites the broader war everyone claims to want to avoid, is a question that genuinely couldn't be answered definitively in the operation's opening hours, and arguably still can't be answered with total certainty even now. There's one more piece of Iran's blockade strategy worth understanding before getting to the final assessment, and that's the mine threat lurking beneath everything else happening on the surface. Unlike fast boats or missiles, sea mines don't announce themselves. They don't require an active launch that satellites can detect in real time, and they can sit dormant for weeks in shipping lanes waiting for exactly the wrong vessel to pass over them. Iran has spent years stockpiling naval mines specifically because they represent one of the cheapest, most deniable ways to keep a choke point dangerous without ever needing to fire a shot in the moment a ship actually gets damaged. That's precisely why any credible operation to reopen the strait has to include a serious mine countermeasures component, running quietly alongside the more visible destroyer escorts and fighter patrols, clearing safe channels methodically before commercial traffic can be trusted to follow behind them. It's slow, unglamorous work compared to a destroyer intercepting a fast boat, but it's arguably just as critical to whether this operation actually succeeds, because a single undetected mine strike on a high-profile vessel could undo weeks of carefully built confidence in a single afternoon. Here's the honesty check worth sitting with as this operation continues to unfold. Iran's blockade of the Strait of Hormuz was never really about winning a conventional military confrontation with the United States Navy. It was about leverage, about using control of one of the world's most economically vital choke points to extract concessions that months of direct combat hadn't managed to produce. Every single vessel that makes it through safely under American escort chips away at that leverage a little further, because the entire value of the blockade depends on the world believing Iran can actually enforce it indefinitely. Project Freedom, by design, is a direct attack on that belief, an attempt to demonstrate through overwhelming sustained military presence that the blockade isn't actually unbreakable, that with enough destroyers, enough aircraft, and enough coordinated escort capability, commercial shipping can move through that corridor regardless of what Iran threatens to do about it. But demonstrating that something is possible in a handful of opening transits is very different from proving it's sustainable over the weeks and months it would actually take to clear a backlog of 1,500 stranded vessels and restore genuine confidence in that corridor's safety. Shipping companies, insurance underwriters, and foreign governments are all watching this operation unfold in real time, and their decisions about whether to actually resume normal traffic through the strait will depend far less on official statements from either side and far more on whether the pattern of safe transits holds consistently over an extended period. A handful of successful escorts followed by an extended pause doesn't rebuild that confidence nearly as effectively as officials in Washington might want the world to believe. It takes sustained, repeated proof, transit after transit, week after week. before the market genuinely treats that corridor as safe again rather than treating each successful passage as a lucky exception to an otherwise dangerous rule. So where does this actually leave things going forward? The operation has already proven the fundamental concept works, that American warships and aircraft can physically escort commercial vessels through even the most contested stretch of the Strait of Hormuz and get them through safely under direct Iranian threat. It's already demonstrated real costs too, in lives lost, in vessels struck, in the ever-present risk of a single miscalculation spiraling into something far larger than either side officially wants. And it's left the two biggest questions hanging over this entire conflict genuinely unresolved: whether this pace of escorted transit can actually scale up to the volume the global economy needs, and whether the fragile ceasefire holding this entire conflict in a strange, uneasy pause can actually survive the sustained pressure of running an operation this large, this close to Iranian forces, for as long as it takes to clear that backlog completely. What happens over the coming days will likely tell us more about the true trajectory of this entire conflict than almost anything that's happened since the ceasefire was first announced. Because unlike a single airstrike or a single missile exchange, this is a sustained, ongoing test of whether military pressure can actually force a lasting change in how this waterway operates, rather than just another temporary spike in an already exhausting cycle of escalation and pause. What do you think happens next? Do you think this operation manages to scale up successfully and genuinely breaks Iran's grip on the strait for good? Or do you think the risk of miscalculation eventually catches up with it and drags this entire conflict back into full-scale combat? There's a genuine case to be made on both sides of that question, and the answer likely won't become clear for weeks rather than days. Let me know what you think in the comments, because this is exactly the kind of high-stakes strategic gamble that reasonable people watching the same set of facts can land on very differently. If this breakdown helped make sense of exactly what's happening out on that water right now, go ahead and like it. Share it with someone trying to understand why oil markets and shipping schedules have been so unstable lately. And subscribe so you don't miss the next update the moment this situation moves again. Because based on everything unfolding right now, it's clearly far from finished. Thanks for watching. And we'll see you in the next one, because the next chapter of this story, out on that water, is likely closer than anyone watching from the outside actually realizes.